The wagon axle broke a mile outside of Coldwater Bend, and the two children inside it did not cry. That was the first thing Silas Rourke noticed as he pulled his bay mare up short on the ridge and looked down at the wreckage on the wagon road. A broken wheel, a dead mule still half in its harness, and a splintered wagon canted sideways in the ditch like a shot bird. He had seen 100 such wrecks in his 41 years on the Kansas plains, and every one of them had a child screaming somewhere in it. These two were silent. He walked the mare down the slope slow, one hand on the rifle across his saddle, the other loose at his side so whoever was in that wagon would see it and know he did not mean to draw. The wind moved the dry grass around him with a sound like a woman breathing in her sleep. It was the second week of September in the year 1878, and the sky over Coldwater County was that particular high, thin blue that comes only after a long dry summer, when the land has given everything it had and is waiting to see what winter will ask of it next. "Hello, the wagon," he called out. There was no answer, only the wind, and then a small, careful movement inside the canvas. A face appeared in the opening at the back. A girl, maybe 11 years old, hair the color of new straw, a smear of dried blood across her forehead like someone had tried to wipe it clean with a dirty thumb. Behind her, half hidden, a smaller boy, 6 or 7, dark-eyed, watching him the way a barn cat watches a stranger's boots. "Anybody hurt bad?" Silas asked. The girl considered the question the way an adult would, weighing what the honest answer would cost her. "No, sir," she said at last. "Our uncle is." He swung down from the saddle. The uncle was under the wagon, and had been for some hours. Silas did not need to lift the canvas over the man's face to know what he would find there. A broken neck. It was quick, at least, and merciful, though those two words together were not always the comfort people believed them to be. He stood for a moment with his hat in his hand. Then he put it back on, because grieving for strangers was a thing a man did privately, and the children were still watching. "What's your name?" he said to the girl. "Ruth." "And him?" "Thomas." "Where were you and your uncle headed?" "Ruth." "Oregon," she said. And then, when he did not answer at once, she added, softer, as if she already knew the word for what she was. "We don't have anywhere else." Before I tell you what he did next, before I tell you how the winter that followed changed 3 lives in ways none of them could have counted on, I want to ask something of you. Wherever you are listening from tonight, a kitchen in Nebraska, a small house in Yorkshire, a farmhouse outside Adelaide, a porch in the Philippines while the rain comes in, I would love it if you left the name of your town in the comments, so we can all see who is gathered around this fire tonight. This story is for you, and it goes better when we know each other. Silas Rourke buried the uncle himself in the loose ground beside the road, with a spade he unstrapped from his own saddle. The girl told him the man's name, Henry Ashford, and stood at the head of the grave with her brother's hand crushed inside her own, while Silas said what little a plain-spoken man could say about a fellow he had never met, that he had been carrying his brother's children toward a better place, that the trying was worth remembering, even when the arriving was not granted. The boy did not cry. The girl did not cry. Silas had lived long enough to know that this was not calm. It was the still, held look of children who had learned very young that tears got you nothing but a slap. He got them up onto the mare, one in front and one behind, and led her the mile into Coldwater Bend with the reins in his hand and a hollow, unfamiliar weight in his chest. Coldwater Bend was a town of 83 souls with a Methodist church, a Baptist church that shared a preacher with 3 other towns, a mercantile, a livery, a saloon that called itself an inn, and a bank that belonged in most practical ways to a man named August Pettibone. Silas did not go into town. He turned off the main road 2 miles before it and took the wagon track east, up through the long draw where the cottonwoods grew, and home. Home was a house he had built with his own hands the year his wife Mary was still alive, and had lived in alone for the 6 years since she was not. A barn, a smokehouse, 240 acres of grass along the creek, running 50 head of cattle in a good year and 30 in a bad one. And this had been a bad one. He had not spoken more than 10 words a day to another human being since the last snow melted. He set the children down at his kitchen table. He put bread and cold beef and the last of the summer's peaches in front of them. He watched the boy eat like a starved dog, and the girl eat slowly, one careful bite at a time, watching her brother, waiting to see if there would be more before she took her share. She was rationing. In his own kitchen, with the food right there in front of her. He got up and cut a second helping and put it down without a word. That night, after he had made them a bed on the floor by the stove out of a folded quilt and a horse blanket, the girl came and stood in the doorway of the kitchen where he was cleaning his rifle at the table. She had that same careful, adult-weighed look on her face. "Mr. Rourke, Silas is fine. Mr. Silas, Thomas and me, we can work. We can chop wood, and I can cook a little, and Thomas is stronger than he looks. He can carry the water, and he can feed the chickens, and we don't eat much, we truly don't. We can." She stopped and started again, more quietly, as though she had rehearsed this next part on the ride up the draw. "We'll work for our keep. We'll earn every bite. I promise you that. We don't want to be a burden on anybody." He set the rag down on the barrel of the rifle. He looked at this 11-year-old child standing barefoot on his kitchen floor, offering him the labor of her small hands in exchange for the right to sleep by his stove. Something in his chest that had been frozen since the January his wife died cracked, quiet and clean, like river ice going out in the thaw. "Ruth," he said, "you'll never owe me." She stared at him. She did not understand it. He could see she was waiting for the catch. He had heard that same waiting in his own voice, once, a long time ago, when he had been a boy her age with nowhere to go. "You hear me," he said. "Not one bite. Not one splinter of firewood. You and your brother sleep here and you eat here because that's what people do. That's the whole of it. That's the arrangement." She did not answer. She only nodded, once, and went back to the kitchen floor and lay down beside her brother and stared at the ceiling for a long time before her eyes closed. Silas Rourke sat at his kitchen table with a half-cleaned rifle in front of him and understood, without permitting himself to say the words, that his life had just been divided into before this evening and after. The trouble came on a Tuesday, 11 days later. August Pettibone rode up the draw at noon with 2 men behind him. Pettibone owned the bank in Coldwater Bend, and through the bank he owned, in one degree or another, most of the paper in the county. He was a heavy man with a soft voice and pale hands that had never mended a fence, and he was smiling when he came up to the porch, which meant that whatever he had come to say was not going to be pleasant. "Silas, August, I hear you've taken in 2 orphans." "I have. You know that ain't strictly a thing a bachelor can just do. I wasn't aware I asked your permission." Pettibone's smile did not waver. He had learned young that a smile was a thing you could wear like a coat, whatever the weather underneath. "The county has a home for such children," he said. "Down in Wichita, Reverend Coyle handles the placements. It'd be a great kindness to the children, Silas. 2 little ones want a proper family, not a widower up a draw who don't know a hair ribbon from a horseshoe. They're not going to Wichita. I could make that difficult. You could try." The 2 men behind Pettibone shifted in their saddles. Silas did not move. He had known August Pettibone since they were both 20, and he understood, the way one hunter understands another, exactly what was underneath this visit. Pettibone did not care about the children. Pettibone cared about the 240 acres of good creek-bottom grass Silas was sitting on, and he had cared about it for 6 years, ever since the year the drought broke Silas nearly in half, and Silas had walked into that bank and borrowed against his herd to keep his land. Silas had made every payment on time. Pettibone had been waiting a long time for a season when he would not. This drought summer had been that season. Silas had missed his August payment by 19 days. He had made it up. Pettibone had accepted it with a smile very like the one he was wearing now. 2 orphans on Silas's land changed the arithmetic. A single man could be pressured. A single man with 2 dependents he could not legally keep was a man who could be broken. "Think about the children, Silas," Pettibone said, gentle as a preacher. "That's all I'm asking." "I am thinking about them," Silas said. Pettibone touched the brim of his hat and turned his horse. Halfway down the draw he stopped and looked back. "The Reverend will be up on Sunday," he called. "Just to meet the little ones. That's all. Just a visit." They watched him go. Ruth was standing in the doorway behind Silas, so quiet he had not heard her come up. She was holding a wooden spoon in both hands, the way a smaller child holds a doll. "He wants to take us," she said. "He wants a lot of things," Silas said. "Will he?" Silas turned and looked down at her. There were freckles across the bridge of her nose he had not noticed before. She had washed her face that morning in the creek. He thought about the mother she must have had, and about the uncle in the shallow grave a mile from town, and about the promise those 2 people had made her without ever saying it aloud, that someone, somewhere, would take her side. "No," he said. He will not. Now, before we walk into what happened next, and I will tell you plainly that what happened next surprised even me the first time I heard this story told. I want you to sit for a moment with what Silas Rourke was carrying. A man who had lived 6 winters alone. A man who did not owe those children anything. Why did he not simply let the county take them? What is it, do you think, that makes a person choose the hard road when the easy one is not only available, but respectable? I would love to hear your thoughts on that, because I suspect the answer is not the same for any two of us. Reverend Coyle arrived on Sunday afternoon in a black buggy with a woman from the county home beside him. He was a thin, pleasant man with weak eyes and Pettibone's marker in his pocket in the form of a 2-year-old loan for a new church roof. Silas met them at the porch with his hat on and Ruth and Thomas behind him inside the house. He had thought about hiding them. He had not. Hiding them was a story that ended one way, and the way it ended was worse than the way this was going to go. "Mr. Rourke," the Reverend said, "we've come to make an assessment." Assess? They came inside. They looked at the kitchen. They looked at the bed on the floor and the folded quilt. They asked Ruth questions Silas could hear from the porch. They asked Thomas questions. Thomas would not speak, and the woman from the home wrote something in a small book, and Silas felt his hands start to close. Then the Reverend stepped back onto the porch, and he would not meet Silas's eyes. "They cannot stay here," he said. "It's not proper. A widowed man alone. No woman in the household. The county will take them Thursday." "Thursday," Silas repeated. "It's for the best." "For whose?" The Reverend flinched. He was not a bad man, Silas understood, only a weak one. And there is a species of harm that weak men do that is worse than what strong, wicked men manage, because the weak men do it while telling themselves it is kindness. The buggy rolled away down the draw. Ruth came out onto the porch and stood beside him with her hand on the porch post, so tight her knuckles had gone white. "Thursday," she said. "Thursday," he said. That night he did not sleep. He sat at the kitchen table with a lamp burning low, and he did the arithmetic of his life the way a rancher does the arithmetic of a hard winter. Cattle, feed, hay, water, weather, the paper he owed and the paper he was owed, the years he had left and the strength in his hands. Toward 2 in the morning he heard a small sound and looked up. Ruth was in the doorway again, in her borrowed nightshirt, and she was crying at last, silently, not making any sound at all, tears running down a face that had not been permitted to cry in the ditch or at the grave or at her uncle's name. He held out his arm. She came and sat against his side and let him put his hand on her hair. Thomas came a few minutes later, sleep-warm and confused, and climbed onto his lap and put his small dark head against Silas's shoulder and slept. Silas sat very still, so as not to wake the boy, and made a decision that he had, in truth, made the first night, when he had promised the girl she would never owe him. He had only needed the days between then and now to understand it. There is a woman in Coldwater Bend named Hannah Vance. She was the schoolteacher, and she had been the schoolteacher for 9 years. She was 34 years old, unmarried, and lived in 2 rooms behind the schoolhouse with a stove and a shelf of books and a small garden. Her fiancé had died in the war when she was 19, and she had not, in the 15 years since, permitted herself to consider that any other life had ever been possible. She taught the children of Coldwater Bend to read and decipher, and on Sundays she played the small parlor organ in the Methodist church, and every night she read 1 chapter of a novel and put out her lamp at 9. Silas Rourke had known her since she was a girl. He had known her father, and he had stood at the back of the church at the memorial service for her Robert in 1863, and he had never in the years since said more than, "Good morning, Miss Vance," to her when he came into town for supplies. He rode into Coldwater Bend at first light on Monday morning. He tied his mare to the rail outside the schoolhouse. He knocked, and when she opened the door with her hair not yet fully pinned and a piece of chalk in her hand, he took off his hat and stood on the step and said the plainest words he had ever said in his life. "Miss Vance, I have got 2 children up at my place, orphans, and the county is coming for them Thursday because there is no woman in the house. I do not have any right to ask you what I am about to ask, but those 2 children have been through a thing that no child should be put through, and if you would consent to marry me on Wednesday, in a court, on paper only, and come up the draw only enough that Reverend Coyle sees a woman in the house, I would spend the rest of my days seeing to it that you never regretted the kindness. There would be no other claim on you. You would keep your school. You would keep your rooms if you wanted them. It would be a document and a name. Nothing else, unless you ever wanted otherwise, which I would not expect and would not ask. He stopped. He had rehearsed it on the ride down, and he had said it exactly as rehearsed, and now he had nothing more to say, and he stood on her step with his hat in his hand and waited for her to close the door in his face. She did not close the door. She looked at him a long time, long enough that he saw her mind move behind her eyes, the way a river moves under thin ice. 15 years of a life she had chosen and not chosen. A schoolroom full of other people's children. 2 rooms and a shelf of books and a lamp put out at 9. Tell me their names, she said. Ruth and Thomas. How old? 11 and 7. What did she say to you? Hannah Vance asked the girl. The first time she spoke to you. Do you remember? He did not have to think. She said they would work for their keep. Hannah Vance closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, they were wet, but her voice was steady. Wednesday, she said. 10 o'clock. I will meet you at the courthouse. They were married on Wednesday morning by a justice of the peace who had never in his career performed a ceremony so brief or so quiet. Ruth and Thomas stood as the witnesses. Silas had bought Ruth a hair ribbon at the mercantile that morning, blue, because he had remembered Pettibone's remark and it had lodged in him like a splinter, and Ruth wore it in her hair for the ceremony and kept it on afterward. Reverend Coyle wrote up the draw on Thursday and found a woman in the kitchen teaching a boy his letters at the table and a marriage certificate on the mantel above the stove, and he stood on the porch a long time before he said, quietly, I see, and rode away, and August Pettibone did not visit again for the rest of that fall. He had lost that round, and he knew it. But August Pettibone was not a man who lost only one round. He was a man who played the winter. The snow came the second week of November. It came hard, and it came early, and by the middle of the month there was 3 feet of it in the draw, and the creek was frozen along the edges, and Silas's 52 head of cattle were huddled in the lee of the cottonwoods, trying to find grass under snow that had crusted overnight into something the color of iron. Pettibone made his move on a Tuesday in December. A rider came up the draw with a paper. The bank was calling Silas's note. Full payment. 30 days. Silas read the paper twice. He did not have the money. He had never, in a December in his life, had the money to pay off the note in one lump. That was the point of a note. The bank had every legal right. Pettibone had waited for a winter hard enough that Silas could not sell cattle at any price that would cover it, and he had waited for a winter hard enough that no other bank in the county would refinance in time, and he had picked his moment the way a wolf picks the calf at the back of the herd. Silas told Hannah that night, after the children were asleep. She had been coming up the draw 3 days a week and staying 2. It had become a rhythm neither of them had spoken about. She listened to him. She did not offer easy comfort. She was not that kind of woman. How much? She said. $412. By January. By the 10th. She was quiet a long time. Then she got up and went to her satchel and took out a small leather book and opened it and looked at it and closed it. I have $360 in the bank in Topeka, she said. From my father. I have never touched it. I never had a reason. He stared at her. Hannah, that is not the arrangement. There is no arrangement, she said. There is what needs to be done. She looked at him for a long moment across the kitchen table in the yellow lamplight, with the snow ticking against the window. Silas, I did not marry you for Ruth. He did not answer. There was nothing to add to that. That is the moment, if you have felt anything at all so far tonight, that I would ask you to press the like button and, if you have not yet, to subscribe. Not because I am asking you to. Because you know what she just gave him, and you know what he was not able to say back to her, and you know how rare it is to see 2 people trust each other that plain and that quiet. If you want more stories like this one, this is how you tell us. They rode into Coldwater Bend together on the 9th of January. Hannah had wired Topeka. The money was in the Coldwater Bank by the time they arrived, transferred, waiting. They walked into August Pettibone's office side by side, and Silas laid the draft on the desk and the $52 in cash they had made up between them, and August Pettibone looked at the paper for a long, still moment, and then he looked up at them, and his smile was gone. You surprise me, Silas. I don't imagine I do. Pettibone signed the release. He was a professional. He knew when to hold and when to let go. What he had not expected, what no man in Coldwater Bend had expected, was that the schoolteacher who had lived alone in 2 rooms for 15 years had $400 of her father's money in a Topeka bank and had decided a widower up a draw and 2 orphan children were what she wanted to spend it on. The story was around town by nightfall. By spring, 3 things had happened that August Pettibone could not have predicted and could not now undo. The first was that Silas Rourke's herd, thin and hard-used but alive, calved out at 41 head in a year. Most ranchers in Coldwater County came out of the winter with 2/3 of what they went in with. He had spent every day of that winter breaking ice on the creek by hand, twice a day, morning and evening, while Ruth carried hot water from the stove to the barn and Thomas learned to fork hay to a heifer without getting kicked. They had earned that calf crop with their 4 sets of hands, and the town knew it. The second was that Hannah Vance, now Hannah Rourke, did not return to her 2 rooms behind the schoolhouse. She kept teaching. She rode down the draw every morning and rode back up every evening. Ruth rode with her 3 days a week and sat in the front row and learned Latin declensions from a woman who had, for 15 years, taught them to no one who cared. The third was that August Pettibone made a mistake. He tried, in March, to call 2 more notes on 2 more small ranchers in the county, thinking to make up in aggregate what he had lost on Silas. One of them was a widow named Alma Beckett with 3 sons and a good quarter section on the East Fork. The county had watched Pettibone move on Silas. The county had watched what had come of it. The county did not, this time, look the other way. A petition circulated. The board of the bank, 4 of whom were ranchers themselves, met in April and voted to remove August Pettibone as president, quietly, without ceremony, citing changes in the direction of the institution. He kept his house. He kept his standing at the Methodist Church. He simply, from that April forward, stopped matching. He would ride down Main Street and men would tip their hats to him and mean nothing by it. And that was the shape of what happened to him. And it was, in its own way, more complete than any louder ending would have been. Ruth turned 12 in May. They had a small supper for her. Hannah baked a cake with the last of the winter's sugar. Thomas gave her a horseshoe nail he had bent into a ring with a hammer and a stone, working on it in secret in the barn for a week. Silas gave her a book Hannah had picked out, a book about a girl who crossed a country on horseback, and Ruth held it in her lap for a long time before she opened it, tracing the letters of her name where Silas had written it on the inside cover in his slow, careful, blocky hand. That night, on the porch, with Thomas asleep against her side and the sky over the draw thick with stars, Ruth said, quietly, so quietly he almost did not catch it, "Mr. Silas. Silas, the first night, when I said we would work for our keep, and you said we would never owe you. I remember. I didn't believe you. I know you didn't." She was quiet for a long time. She was braiding a piece of grass between her fingers, the way children do. When she spoke again, her voice was steadier than any 11-year-old girl's voice had any right to be, and he understood that she was not 11 anymore, and had not been for some while, and might never have been. "I believe you now," she said. He did not answer. There was nothing to add to that. 4 years later, in the summer of 1882, a photographer came up from Wichita on the New Spur line and set up his camera in front of the Coldwater Bend Methodist Church for the wedding of Alma Beckett's oldest son to a girl from Missouri. Half the county turned out. In the photograph, if you looked carefully at the second row from the back, you would see a tall, weathered man in a good coat with his hand on the shoulder of a boy of 11, and beside him a woman with her hair in a plain knot and a slight, quiet smile, and beside her a young woman of 16 with straw-colored hair and freckles across her nose and a blue ribbon in her hair, the same ribbon, though nobody in the photograph but the 4 of them would ever have known it. The photograph hung on the wall of the kitchen in the house up the draw for the next 41 years. Long after Silas Rourke had gone into the ground beside a wife who outlived him by only 14 months. Long after Thomas had grown up and taken over the herd and married a woman from Nebraska and filled the house with children of his own. Long after Ruth Rourke, who kept her father's name until the day she died at 93, had become the first woman elected to the Coldwater County School Board, and had, in her long life, done a great many things her uncle in the shallow grave outside town would have been proud of, and one small quiet thing that mattered more than all of them. She had taken in, over the course of 30 years of teaching, 7 orphan children of her own, and to each of them, on the first night, she had said the same words, in the same voice, the way you pass down a lamp. "You will never owe me. Thank you for staying with us tonight around this fire. Next Sunday, We ride south into the Texas Panhandle in the spring of 1885, where a young black woman named Delphine Carter rides alone up to the gate of the largest cattle ranch in 3 counties, dismounts, and tells the foreman she has come for the job his advertisement said was for a man. What she does in the 6 months that follow will shame every man who laughed at her that morning, and the ranch owner's son will never look at another woman the same way for the rest of his life. I hope you will come back and sit with us for that one. Until then, mind the cold, mind the ones you love, and remember that the kindest thing you can ever say to somebody who has nothing left is that they do not owe you a single thing. Good night.